All right. Is it Mr. Rubart here then?
Yes.
All right. Then at this point, can you radio Marcy and tell her to get, is she getting the jury? I think she's at the door, so can you radio her? Guzman, can you radio her? Okay. You may be seated. State, you may call your next witness.
State recalls Arthur Rubart.
Mr. Rubart, please come forward. You're still under oath. So you haven't been released from your subpoena, so just have a seat in the witness stand.
Mr. Rubart, let me direct your attention to January 25th, 2019. We've heard your testimony about everything that you did at that residence. But for purposes of my questions now, tell us when after the search warrant was obtained, did you actually enter the residence? Approximately.
It was approximately a little bit after the search warrant was obtained, which was about 2 o'clock.
I'm sorry?
2 o'clock?
Okay. And at what point was Chad Amato's body, and once again approximately, removed from the residence?
It would have been later on that evening. If I could look at my notes to refresh my memory.
If it would refresh your recollection, then please do so.
You may.
Okay, it would have been after 21:08 hours, which is 9:08 p.m.
And during that time, were you in the residence processing it?
Yes, I was.
At any point during that time, from the time that you first entered the house to the time that Chad Amato's body was removed, was there any fingerprint scanning done of Chad Amato?
No, there was not.
Now, let me actually mark this for identification. Showing a defense counsel 15Q for identification. May I approach the witness, Your Honor? Let me show you what's been marked as 15Q for identification. You recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And what does that depict, 15Q for identification?
It is a photograph of Chad Amato.
True, in his clothing on the floor in the kitchen?
That is correct.
True and accurate depiction of Chad Amato in his clothing on the floor in the kitchen?
Yes, it is.
I'd offer this into evidence as a state's exhibit.
What's been pre-marked for ID is State's Exhibit 15Q will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 346 in evidence.
And if I could just briefly publish it, Your Honor, please.
You may.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Yes, you do.
All right. One moment. Were there any more questions?
I do. One more question, Your Honor. Mr. Rubart, as the lead crime scene technician in this case, would you let anybody disturb or move that body before you were done processing the scene, and particularly processing the body?
No, I would not.
Any questions?
No questions, ma'am.
Members of the jury, do you have any questions of this witness? And everyone's shaking their head no? All right. May this witness be excused at this point?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. You're excused. You may call your next witness.
Allison LaNeve.
Ms. LaNeve, if you could please come forward to the podium, raise your right hand, be ready to be sworn.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the complete truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
you please have a seat in the witness stand as the deputy instructs you. You may.
Good afternoon, how are you?
Good afternoon, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you. You tired?
A little bit.
Okay, and you fly in from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh?
Yes, sir. I flew in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania this morning.
Okay, and before that, you were in the Turks and Caicos
Yes, sir, I was, for another trial.
for another trial. So you've been moving around quite a bit the past couple of days.
Yes, sir.
Okay. First, tell us, what is your name, please?
My name is Allison, Allison, LaNeve, LaNeve.
Please tell us, what is your occupation?
I am the manager and a forensic scientist at a company called RJ Lee Group. That's RJLEE Group. It's in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, very close to Pittsburgh. RJ Lee Group is a materials analysis company. There's lots of different departments within the company, and we do lots of different scientific analyses. Within the company, we have a small forensics department, and I'm the manager of that forensics department.
And you kind of anticipated my questions. Let me ask you, as manager, maybe pretty obvious, but tell the jury what your duties are as manager.
Sure, absolutely. The forensics lab at RJ Lee Group specializes in what we refer to as trace evidence. Trace evidence is small evidence that you might not necessarily see with the naked eye. Things like hair, fibers, and especially gunshot residue. We specialize in gunshot residue. As the manager of the forensics department at RJ Lee Group, I am responsible for accepting evidence into custody, for processing that evidence, analyzing the evidence, preparing reports, and testifying to the evidence when necessary.
And how long have you been with the RJ Lee Group?
I've actually been with RJ Lee Group since 2002, immediately after I graduated from high school. I worked as an intern there all through college and was hired full-time in May of 2007. So I've been there approximately 17 years.
And I think you touched upon this a few moments ago, but tell the jury, what do you do at RJ Lee Group?
As the manager of the forensics department, again, I receive evidence and I process that evidence. That means I photograph it and I document how it was received and in what state it was received. I then would prepare that evidence for analysis. Sometimes that requires something called carbon coding, which is a technique that puts a light layer of carbon over top of the samples in order for us to visualize them. Part of my responsibilities include the analysis of gunshot residue samples that utilizes an instrument called the scanning electron microscope. Through that microscope, we would analyze potential samples for gunshot residue, and then we would gather those results and put them into the format of a report and send a report out based on those samples.
With respect to the gunshot residue analysis, would you please tell the jury training, education, experience, your background in that particular area?
Yes, sir. I have my Bachelor's of Arts in Biochemistry. I received that from Duquesne University in May of 2006. I also have my Master's of Science in Forensic Science and Law. I received that in May of 2007, also from Duquesne University. Through my education, I took several courses which relate to trace evidence and specific classes that relate to gunshot residue analysis. I also underwent training at RJ Lee Group under the tutelage of several other gunshot residue experts already in the field. That included being proficiency tested as well as analyzing over 500 samples of gunshot residue before I was able to take my first case. Along with that, I am a member of several professional forensic organizations. I am published in Forensic Science magazine, and I have also done many presentations within the field of trace evidence.
Have you previously testified as an expert in the field of gunshot residue?
Yes, sir, I have.
And can you tell us, or approximately, how many times have you so testified?
This is approximately my 130th opportunity to testify in court.
And generally, where have you testified?
I have testified in 19 of the United States of America, in the country of Bermuda, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the country of Turks and Caicos.
Now, tell the jury what is gunshot residue.
Sure. In the most basic sense of the words gunshot residue, that is the stuff that comes out of a firearm whenever it's discharged. A lot of people think that you're loading a bullet into a firearm. You're actually not. You're loading what is referred to as a cartridge into a firearm, and a bullet is part of that cartridge. Now, typically, if you look at the end of a cartridge, it looks, specifically when we have center fire ammunition, it looks like a target or a bullseye, okay? In the center of that bullseye is what we refer to as the primer cap. Within that primer cap, there's something called the primer mixture or the primer paste. And there are three important elements that are in that primer mixture. Those elements are lead, antimony, and barium. Now what happens is when the trigger is pulled, something called the firing pin is going to tap the center of that bullseye, and that causes a spark, which initiates a reaction. And that reaction is very high heat and very high pressure. And it's so hot and it's so pressurized that it pushes the bullet forward and out of the firearm. At the same time that that's occurring, as the bullet is leaving the firearm, those elements of lead and antimony and barium that are in the primer cap escape the firearm in any available opening in the firearm. Any little crack or crevice is an opening, is an escape route for those particles. It forms what we refer to as the plume around the firearm. It sort of looks like a vaporous cloud of smoke. Within that plume, as the temperature starts to cool, those elements of lead and antimony and barium condense together, creating a particle type known as a particle characteristic of gunshot residue. So they are particles that contain lead and antimony and barium. I like to think about it as if it's a recipe, as if you're making a cake. Let's say you have all your ingredients, your eggs, your sugar, your oil, your water, you mix it all together and you get a batter. That's what's happening in the plume. I have my different ingredients condensing together, creating particles that are characteristic of gunshot residue. Aside from those three component characteristic particles, there's also what we refer to as two component particles. Those are particles that contain just two of those three elements. So lead and antimony, or lead and barium, or barium and antimony. So within that plume, we have characteristic three-component gunshot residue particles. We have two-component particles, which are particles we say are consistent with gunshot residue. We also have one-component particles, which are just particles of just lead, or just antimony, or just barium. Those particles then land on the hands, the clothing, the surrounding area of the shooter. And it's those particles, those characteristic three-component particles, that I'm referring to when I'm saying gunshot residue.
Now, under what circumstances can gunshot residue be deposited or placed onto an object, a person, or an article of clothing?
When gunshot residue is found on an individual, we can say one of three things occurred. We can say the individual either, number one, discharged a firearm, number two, was in close proximity or near when someone discharged a firearm, or number three, came into contact with an area or an environment that contained gunshot residue.
Now, is gunshot residue transferable?
Yes, it's possible for gunshot residue to be transferred from one surface to another surface.
Explain that, if you could, please, a little more.
Sure. If I have gunshot residue on my hands, for example, if it is known that I have gunshot residue on my hands and I shake somebody else's hand, I could transfer gunshot residue from my hand onto another person's hands. If I have gunshot residue on my hands and I wipe my hands on my jacket or put my hands in and out of my pockets, I can transfer gunshot residue from my hands onto my jacket or my pockets. If a firearm had recently been discharged and then I pick up that firearm, I could transfer gunshot residue from that firearm onto my hands. So when I say transfer, there has to be an element of contact from an area of something that has gunshot residue on it to something else.
Can gunshot residue be lost?
Yes.
Simply over time lost?
Yes, gunshot residue can be lost, and there are several different factors that can contribute to particulate loss.
Can you explain that, please?
Sure. Kind of just using the last hypothetical, if I have gunshot residue on my hands, I can wipe my hands on my jacket and eliminate the particles from my hands onto my jacket. I could wash my hands if I have gunshot residue on them and eliminate all potential residue that's on my hands. So movement, motion, activity, specifically washing, is a factor that can contribute to particulate loss. Weather. If it's raining, if it's windy, if there's any type of air movement, that can contribute to particulate loss. Time is also a factor. The longer the amount of time between the discharge and the collection, the more potential there is to lose gunshot residue. Biological material. If my hands are sweaty, if there's blood on my hands, that could mask potential particulate, not allowing me to extract it.
Now, you mentioned time. Can you just give us, explain or just give us some examples of the passage of time between the deposit of gunshot residue and then the collection of gunshot residue? Why would time be a factor?
So let's assume our firearm is a good depositor of particles. One thing I should mention is that not all firearms are going to produce the same amount of residue. Some firearms are going to produce far more, some are going to produce far less. Let's assume that our firearm is a good depositor of particles. If I discharge that firearm and collect samples from my hands immediately after I discharge that firearm, I could find hundreds of gunshot residue particles on my hands. But let's say I discharge that firearm and then I go about my business for the next 2 hours, just walking as I would normally. Perhaps I use the restroom and wash my hands. 4 hours later, I collect samples from my hands. It's possible not to find any gunshot residue after that. Research has indicated that the biggest likelihood to find gunshot residue on an individual's hands is within about 5 hours after the discharge of a firearm. That time increases if you're doing a collection from clothing or another surface in which those particles get trapped in the weave of a fabric.
And even with gunshot residue being, trapped in the weaving of a particular clothing, would time also be a consideration regarding whether or not that gunshot residue remains?
Time would be a factor in so much that it would allow a longer period of time for movement or motion or activity to occur. So the more time between the discharge and the collection, the more possibility there is for movement and motion of a particular garment.
Now, explain the process of actually collecting a sample for analysis and then the actual analysis process itself.
Sure. The type of collection media that is used to collect for gunshot residue is something that is called a stub, S-T-U-B. It's a small aluminum insert. It's about the size of a dime, and it's held in a plastic capsule or a plastic vial. The lid is taken off of that vial to expose the surface of that stub. And on the surface of that stub, there's a really heavy-duty double-stick tape. It's a strong adhesive material. That stub is then used to do what we call particle extraction. So what we do is we take that stub and we dab over the area of interest, up and down, going back and forth, and then up and down vertically, ensuring that we cover the entire surface area of interest. So if it's an individual's hands, we would cover the entire surface area of the hands. If it's a t-shirt, we would cover the entire front surface area of the t-shirt in that same motion, that dabbing motion. That's called particle extraction. Those stubs, that aluminum pin mount that's part of that stub, is then taken completely out of the vial and put directly into the scanning electron microscope. So a lot of times when people think of a microscope, they think of that instrument that you used in high school that's sitting on a lab bench that you're looking down into eyepieces at. That's not exactly what a scanning electron microscope is. A scanning electron microscope is a large machine, and samples are put into a drawer, which is put under vacuum. An electron beam is shot down on the samples, and we are able to see the interaction between the sample and the electron beam on a computer monitor. So if you imagine that you have a video recorder or a camcorder, and you can videotape just wherever you might be. And let's imagine your video recorder is plugged into your television set. As you're videotaping, you can see what you're videotaping on your television set, okay? That's kind of the way a scanning electron microscope works. It scans across the top of a sample and allows me to see the top of that sample on a computer monitor. The only difference is I'm looking at the top of that sample about 5,000 times its actual size. So I'm looking at incredibly small particles that can't be seen with the naked eye, and I'm looking for them on a computer screen.
And then how do you determine if the particular components that you talked about before are present?
The scanning electron microscope does an automated analysis where it scans back and forth across the sample looking for particular elements. It's looking for the elements of lead, antimony, and barium. Because those elements are very dense, they appear very bright on the screen. So the instrument is looking for particles that are above a certain brightness level. It stops. Once it comes across one of those particles, the instrument stops, it takes a picture of the particle, and it records kind of the X and Y coordinates of where that particle is. Then myself, as the analyst, sit down and re-pull up the location of those particles so I myself can look at the particle firsthand to ensure that it contains the elements of lead, antimony, or barium. And I'm also looking at the shape of the particle. Particles of gunshot residue are going to appear smooth or round or molten looking because they're the result of a high temperature burn.
Now, may I approach on the witness? Let me show you what's already been introduced into evidence as State's Exhibit 203. And if you need to wear gloves, go ahead. I'm not going to touch them. Can you open up that, and I will. Well, first of all, before you do, can you look at what's, as I said, been introduced into evidence as State's 203, and tell me if you recognize any markings on that envelope?
Yes, sir, I do recognize markings on the envelope.
And what do you excuse me, what do you recognize?
First off, I recognize RJ Lee Group sample labels, which contain our project number as well as the sample numbers that were assigned to the stubs. And I also recognize evidence tape that contains my initials, AML, as well as the date in which this envelope was sealed.
Okay. Did you receive a State's 203 to perform gunshot residue testing?
Yes, sir, we did.
Let me give you a pair of scissors.
I think there's one here, sir, actually.
Thank you. Can you open it up, please?
I can.
Do you recognize what's contained in State's 203?
Yes, sir, I do.
And please tell the jury what is contained within State's 203.
In States 203, there is a pair of black leather gloves that were received at RJ Lee Group for particle extraction and gunshot residue analysis.
Let me show you. What's marked for identification as 12V. May I approach, Your Honor? And ask you to first, if you can open it up, and tell me if you recognize what's contained within 12V for identification.
Yes, I do recognize it.
What is in 12V for identification?
12V contains the samples that I referred to as stubs previously that were used to conduct particle extraction on each one of the gloves. They are labeled with RJ Lee Group's sample numbers as well as my initials and the date.
Obviously, those are the stubs you used in this case.
Yes, sir.
I'd offer this into evidence as a State's exhibit. Your Honor.
And what was the pre-mark on that again? 12V, as in Victor. What's been pre-marked for ID as State's Exhibit 12V will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 346-7 in evidence.
I'll place both of them in front of you and ask more questions. Now, did you use those stubs that have just been introduced into evidence to do a particle extraction from the gloves that are in States 203?
Yes, sir, I did.
And explain, and if you need to demonstrate, then please do so. I'd like you to demonstrate. Can you show the jury what you did as part of your particle extraction process? and particularly, specifically where on the gloves you did it.
Okay, these were the two stubs that were used to conduct particle extraction on each one of the gloves. This glove was labeled as left hand. It was used on the left-handed glove. This glove is labeled as right hand. It was used on the right-handed glove. And just to minimize particulate movement, I'm just going to use a latex glove as if this were one of the black gloves. So the very first thing we did was open the evidence and photograph it so that we had a record of what it looked like whenever we received it. From there, we used one of these stubs. When I say we, I mean I used one of these stubs. The lid was taken off of the stub to expose the surface of the adhesive material. I'm going to put the lid back on it, but the next part was done with the lid off of it, okay? From there, we literally dabbed up, and I'll hold it up to show. We dabbed back and forth across the surface of the glove, going from the wrist all the way down through the fingers, back and forth, and then up and down, creating a grid-like pattern over on top of the entire surface area of the glove. So we did that technique on one side of the glove and the other side of the glove. We did not particle extract inside the glove. This was only the surface of the glove. And we did that particle extraction technique on each of the two gloves using two respective sample stubs.
And as you explained just a few moments ago, after collecting or doing your particle extraction, did you then analyze the particle extractions that were recovered?
Yes, I did analyze them. Prior to putting those samples into the scanning electron microscope, a step that we call carbon coating is done prior to that. So a light layer of carbon is placed on top of that adhesive material, and that's done so that I can see the particles in the sample. It's so, if we don't put that layer of carbon on top of those samples, something called charging occurs in the instrument. And it's basically, it's as if your television ever goes out and you get those white lines through your television, that's kind of what would happen if we didn't put that carbon on top of it. So we grounded the samples by putting a layer of carbon on top of them, and then we put the samples in the scanning electron microscope for analysis.
Now, with respect, I'm going to go glove by glove. With respect to the right hand glove, what were the results of your analysis?
Your Honor, may I refer to my report?
Will it refresh your memory?
Yes, it will.
You may.
Thank you. The sample that was taken from the right hand black leather glove, a total of 3 characteristic gunshot residue particles were found on that glove, and at least 10 two-component particles were found on that glove.
With regard to the left hand, what were the results of your analysis?
On the sample that was taken from the left-handed black leather glove, there was a total of 7 particles characteristic of gunshot residue and 7 two-component particles.
Now, with regard to the right-handed glove, you just told us that there was a total of particle characteristic of gunshot residue 3. Explain what that means. What does, and I think you touched upon it earlier, now that you're telling us the actual results of the analysis, what does that mean, particles that are characteristic of gunshot residue?
Sure. Just to refresh your memory, The particles that are characteristic of gunshot residue are the particles that contain all three of those important elements. Those particles contain lead, antimony, and barium. Those particles have a corresponding shape or morphology that is consistent with a high heat reaction, so they're rounded or smooth or molten looking. And there's also no other element present in those particles that indicate to me that they came from another source. So those three particles characteristic of gunshot residue fit all three of those factors.
And now you also, with regard to the right hand, total 2 component particles, explain that. And how many were there?
Yes, sir. There was at least 10 two-component particles confirmed on the right-handed glove. That means that 10 particles found on the glove were either combinations of lead and antimony, or lead and barium, or barium and antimony. Those are those two-component particles that are consistent with gunshot residue. The reason why we use the word at least 10 is because there could be more particles, but we limit ourselves to the amount we look at. The reason for that is whether or not there's 10 particles there or 11 particles there, it doesn't change what the results mean. The fact of the matter is there were 10 particles there and they were confirmed, but there could be more.
And with regard to the left hand, total particles characteristic of gunshot residue, 7. Once again, the same explanation that you just gave us a moment ago with regard to the right hand?
Yes, sir. On the left-handed glove, there were 7 particles that contained all three of those important elements of gunshot residue found on the left glove. Those particles also had a shape or morphology that was consistent with gunshot residue, and there was nothing in those particles to indicate that they came from a source other than gunshot residue.
And once again, talking about the left hand, a total of 2 component particles, 7 of those?
Yes, sir. On the left-hand black leather glove, there were 7 two-component particles found. So 7 particles that contained a combination of 2 of those 3 elements. Again, having corresponding shape and not containing any other element to indicate a different source.
Now, you mentioned that the 3 component particles is characteristic of gunshot residue.
Yes, sir.
Are there, and you alluded to this just a few moments ago when you talked about the 3 component particles. Are there any other sources other than gunshot residue where those 3 component particles may exist or originate from?
Yes, sir. Research has shown that there are a few other sources that those 3 component particles have been seen in. However, there is usually an indicator element to let me know I'm looking at a population of particles from something else and not from gunshot residue. So, for example, there's a certain type of firework called a crackering ball that produces particulate that contains lead, antimony, and barium. However, with that particular firework, those particles also typically have a high amount of magnesium present in those particles as well. One of the other sources is brake dust or dust from brake pad linings. There has been a study showing that there were particles containing lead and antimony and barium found from brake pad dust on some Volkswagens in Italy. And those particular particles also had a high amount of iron. Another source is airbag deployment. From some airbags being deployed, you can sometimes get particulate that is consistent with those 3 component particles. However, they again also contain or typically contain elements that are not typical of gunshot residue, and they are usually of a different shape. They're not molten or round. And finally, the final source known to create a particulate that contains those three component particles are things that use a primer to function. For example, a nail gun that might use a primer to force a nail out of a particular instrument or tool. And again, there are typically elements that indicate to me that I'd be looking at a population coming from a nail gun and not from a firearm.
Now, in this particular case, in addition to the three component particles that you observed, did you observe anything additional that would indicate that it would come from a source other than gunshot residue?
In this particular case, no, I did not. I did not observe or confirm any other element in the particles that are reported here that would indicate that they came from a source other than gunshot residue.
Like the fireworks, brake dust, airbags, a nail gun,
Correct.
that was not observed in this particular case?
There was nothing to indicate to me, no, sir.
I have nothing further.
Cross?
Good afternoon, Ms. LaNeve.
Good afternoon.
Am I saying your name right, LaNeve?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, a positive gunshot residue test doesn't mean that someone actually fired a firearm, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And a positive gunshot residue test doesn't mean the person tested likely fired a gun either, correct?
That's correct. All it means is it's a possibility.
You stole my next question. So you would confirm the most you could possibly draw from a positive gunshot residue test is that they possibly fired, maybe, a firearm, correct?
They either discharged a firearm, were in proximity or near someone who discharged a firearm, or touched something that had gunshot residue on it.
And that's because someone who tests positive for gunshot residue, there are even circumstances where they fired a gun and there was no gunshot residue found. That's correct as well, right?
That is a possibility, given certain factors surrounding that particular incident.
Sometimes somebody could fire a gun and no gunshot residue could be there. Is that correct?
It's possible, unlikely, but possible, but it depends on the factors between the time of the discharge and the time of collection.
Right, I understand, but it is possible, correct?
It is possible.
It's possible that someone who tests positive for gunshot residue didn't actually fire a gun, based on this transfer that you were describing earlier, correct?
Yes, sir, that's possible too.
Now, in your report under qualifiers, you specifically stated gunshot residue can be deposited by coming into contact with a surface or object that gunshot residue was on, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, these are surfaces that all gun owners or people who have previously owned guns would probably have in their room, correct?
When you say services, what did you?
Oh, surfaces.
Oh, surfaces, I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry if I...
No, that's quite all right. If somebody is a gun owner or owns firearms that have been discharged, it's possible that there would be residue on surfaces in which those guns are being held.
Right, because you said that residue can be deposited by coming into contact with a surface or object that has gunshot residue on it. So these surfaces would be very likely to be in someone's home that had firearms and had fired firearms on those surfaces, correct?
It would be more likely if a firearm was discharged over a particular surface. But if there is residue on a firearm that had been recently discharged and that was brought onto a surface or an area, it can transfer from that firearm to that area. So to answer your question, yes, it's possible.
So if you go to a firearms range, you shoot a gun, you go home, there's a surface, you place that gun, the magazine that was in the gun that was fired, and spent cartridges, that isn't just the casings, onto a surface, that would have gunshot residue on that surface, correct?
It's possible.
Is it likely?
I can't say that it's likely because there's a lot of steps in between the discharge to actually going to place it on a surface. It's not unlikely, it's not likely, it's possible.
So the gun's not wiped down necessarily, but it's just right from the range to the surface. You're saying that there's no necessary way to state that likely or unlikely that gunshot residue would end up on that surface?
I could,
In that hypothetical?
in a hypothetical, let's assume that the firearm is a good depositor of particles.
Sure.
Let's assume that nothing, absolutely nothing was done from that firearm. It was held like this after it had been discharged and then taken into an individual's house and placed down, then it's, again, possible, maybe even likely in that circumstance. However, wind flow, movement, motion. For example, if the firearm is placed on the seat of a vehicle or in a holster, you could transfer particulate from the gun onto another intervening surface before it's taken into the home.
How about used magazines? As in used magazine in gun, fired at range, taken home, magazine not removed, as in from fired in gun, still in gun, taken home, magazine taken out of gun, magazine put onto surface. That would likely have gunshot residue on that surface in that circumstance, correct?
I'm going to limit my response to it's possible.
Okay. Now, gun owners or even people who have owned guns in the past in their rooms would have gunshot residue on surfaces where they previously stored used firearms, firearm parts, and used cartridges. That is likely in that circumstance, correct?
I'm sorry, you said no gun owner would have particulate?
No, I'm sorry. Gun owners or people who have previously owned guns that have owned them in the past and that go to the range and shoot guns and then bring them home would probably have surfaces in that home or in their room where the guns are stored where gunshot residue would be. That is likely, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, you could touch a fired gun and then another surface and cause gunshot residue to be transferred to that surface. Is that correct?
If there is particulate on that fired gun to begin with, yes, you can touch that gun and then touch something else and transfer that residue that way. That's possible.
How about a used magazine? Same thing?
If there is gunshot residue on that magazine to begin with, then that's possible.
Okay, so when you fire a gun and then you open the gun up afterwards, it's dirty, correct?
Those are more questions for a firearms examiner.
Okay, so you can't speculate that the inside of a gun, or you can't have an opinion that when you fire a gun, gunshot residue would be inside that gun?
I can tell you that primer residue comes out of openings in firearms. So ejection port, muzzle, little cracks and crevices. Primer residue being on a magazine in a firearm, that's possible, yes.
Okay. So in a house, for instance, you could touch a fired gun and then other objects in the house and cause there to be transfer, correct?
That's possible, yes, sir.
Now, switching topics, the likelihood someone fired a gun, based on gunshot residue tests, based on that type of test, could come down to the particle count found, correct?
No, you cannot assign likelihoods as to which one of those three possibilities would have occurred, with the exception of if it's an inanimate object, obviously. For example, a vehicle can't discharge a firearm.
So you're saying the particle count is irrelevant to whether someone fired a firearm or not?
Yes, that's true, sir.
So why do you even test for it?
Well, it's more so whether or not it's there or not. Whether it's one particle, whether it's 10 particles, whether it's 100 particles. The reason why that gunshot residue is there is one of those three reasons. A person could discharge a firearm and have one particle on them or 100 particles on them. A person could be standing next to an individual who discharged a firearm and have one particle on them or 100 particles on them. And a person can touch something that has gunshot residue on them and transfer one particle or more than one particle.
The particle count could be in the hundreds possibly. Could it be in the thousands as well?
It's certainly possible. I've never seen thousands of particles, but we limit our analysis to detecting 100 gunshot residue particles.
Okay, so you've seen 100 particles before.
I have seen 100 particles detected.
And they go even higher than that, you just don't test for it, correct?
Correct, sir.
So you wouldn't call a 20 or less particle count to be low. You just have no opinion about that.
Whether or not you would consider 20 to be a low number, I think is dependent on so many different factors. 20 is a population of gunshot residue, is what I would say.
A population of gunshot residue? You mean
Yes,
like
sir.
there's just a group of it, that's what you're saying?
There's a group of gunshot residue, and it's there because of one of those three reasons.
Okay, and you're not gonna have any judgment about what is a high or a low particle count regardless of how high or low it could possibly be?
I can tell you that I have analyzed cases in which I've seen much lower numbers, and I've analyzed cases in which I've seen higher numbers. There's so many factors that contribute to how many particles are actually detected and confirmed that I can't say whether or not it's actually a high number or a low number.
But there's a lot more room up to 100 than down to 0 based on these numbers, correct?
Well, if this particular firearm only produces 30 particles, then 20 would be a high number.
But you're not aware of that, correct? Because you don't know what the firearm is in this case, correct?
That's correct, sir.
A person could get a particle count of 20 or less from coming into contact with police or other people. Is that possible?
It's possible if there is gunshot residue on that surface to begin with.
People have gotten that from just having contact with the police, isn't that correct?
Say that again.
People have gotten a 20 or less particle count from just coming in contact with police officers, isn't that correct?
Yes, research has indicated that coming into contact with police officers, especially ones who have recently qualified discharging their firearm, that you can get gunshot residue from police officers. However, research has indicated that the numbers transferred from police officers is much lower.
But that has happened before, correct?
It has happened.
Have you ever seen foam inserts that are in briefcase-style gun cases?
Foam inserts, probably just in the movies.
Okay, you've never seen one personally?
No, sir.
Okay. But assuming that, like we had stated earlier, there are certain surfaces in someone's home that if someone took a gun back from the range and placed on certain surfaces, it would have gunshot residue on it, possibly, correct?
It's possible, yes, sir.
And one of these possible surfaces could be one of these foam inserts. I know you haven't seen it, but you've seen it in the movies, correct?
If there's gunshot residue on a surface, even a foam insert, it's possible for it to transfer if it comes into contact with something.
Gunshot residue can be transferred from surface to surface, can it?
Yes, it can. Those surfaces have to come into contact with one another.
Right, so once the surfaces contact each other, that could transfer gunshot residue from one surface to another, isn't that correct?
That's possible, sir.
And gunshot residue just doesn't go away on its own, correct?
Meaning, does it disintegrate or fall apart?
Correct.
No, three-component particles aren't just going to break apart into their individual components, unless they're treated with a strong acid.
It doesn't expire or anything like that? That you're aware of?
Not that I'm not sure what you mean by expired.
As in go away on its own, like we were just talking about?
I mean, if I have gunshot residue on my hands, I could wash my hands and eliminate it, but it's not just going to vanish.
Right. What about on a surface? It would stay there until moved or something else. It just doesn't expire by sitting there, correct?
Until acted upon by an outside source, yes, sir.
So based on what you're saying, these gloves that you tested could have come in contact with a surface that had gunshot residue on them and transferred to the gloves, correct? Because you said the surfaces could cause that transfer, correct?
That's a possibility.
Now, you were only given these gloves to test in this case. You weren't given any additional garments or anything else, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you didn't test the inside of these gloves, correct?
I did not test the inside of the gloves, no, sir.
No further questions.
What is tertiary transfer?
Tertiary transfer is when there are three intervening steps or three steps to a transfer. So if I have gunshot residue on my hands and I touch this book, that's primary transfer. If somebody comes along and picks up the book and there's gunshot residue going from the book to that person's hands, that's secondary transfer. If somebody comes along and shakes hands with that person, and gunshot residue goes from my hands to the book to the second person's hands who's shaking the third person's hands, that's tertiary transfer. So there's intervening steps, 1, 2, 3.
The hypothetical that Mr. Shapiro gave, where gun is discharged, gun placed on table, gloves placed on table where the, gun removed, gun placed on, gloves placed on table, and then the gunshot residue getting on the gloves. What, is that tertiary transfer?
Okay. Residue from the gun going onto the table is primary transfer. Gloves going onto the table after the gun is removed is secondary transfer. However, if you count primer residue landing on the firearm first, that's primary transfer. Then the firearm seated on the table, that's secondary transfer. And then the gloves on top of that table, that would be tertiary transfer.
So the hypothetical that Mr. Shapiro gave would be tertiary transfer?
I would consider that tertiary transfer.
And as each level of transfer occurs, is the likelihood decrease that gunshot residue will be deposited on the final object?
The more steps that you add in between the initial transfer to the final transfer, the less likely it is for particles to be at the end of that train.
Okay, thank you. I have no more questions.
Any more questions, members of the jury? All right, at this point, yes.
One recross based on the additional information.
Go ahead.
Ms. LaNeve, I have one last question for you.
Yes, sir.
So, on a surface, gun parts that are used, guns, magazines, spent cartridges are being put on there again and again and again and again. That would make it more likely that gunshot residue would be on there, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, no further questions.
Any redirect off of that? No. All right, members of the jury, question, come forward, please, counsel, parties. Some of our jurors have questions for you.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the caliber of a bullet by examining gunshot residue?
No, I cannot. The majority of firearms are going to produce the same type of primer residue, the particles that contain lead, antimony, and barium.
Could the subject gloves have been washed and still have residue on them?
It's possible, but unlikely. Research has shown that washing a garment eliminates most, if not all, of gunshot residue, but it is still possible to find it there after laundering.
Can the amount of gunshot residue lessen by coming in contact with other items, like with gloves being in a bag?
Yes, the more potential there is for movement, motion, activity, or coming into contact with other surfaces, that could contribute to particulate loss. So if I have gunshot residue on my hands and I shake one person's hands, it's likely that some of that residue will be removed. If I shake two people's hands, it's likely that more residue will be removed, and so on down the line.
Any questions based on those questions, Mr. Stone? Any questions based on those questions?
None, Judge.
Any more questions, members of the jury? All right, may this witness be excused and released. Thank you very much, ma'am. You're excused and you're released from your subpoena.
Thank you.
All right. State, you may call your next witness.
Your Honor, we have just a couple of documents. We have some documents that we'd like to introduce, one by stipulation and the others by a records certification.
All right,
And then the rest.
what are those?
With regard to the document via stipulation, states Exhibit 7B and 7C. B as in boy,
B as in boy.
C as in cat.
All right. And as to 7B and C, they're stipulated to, is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right, then what's been pre-marked for ID as State's Exhibit 7B will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 348 in evidence. And then what's been pre-marked for ID as State's Exhibit 7C will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 349 in evidence.
For the record, Judge, State's Exhibit 348, the Florida Gun Exchange seller receipt, Grand Amato dated 8/21/2018, wherein the defendant sold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 firearms. State's Exhibit 349, for the record, is a Florida Gun Exchange receipt dated 8/24/2018, where the defendant sold 2 firearms. The next documents the state would move in via business record certifications would be 7E, as an elephant. And that would be a composite exhibit of business records from USA Federal Savings Bank for checking, credit, records for Cody, Chad, and Grand Amato.
Do you have the certification so the court can view it, please?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Any objection, defense?
No objection, Judge.
All right, what's been pre-marked for ID as State's Exhibit 7E will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 350 in evidence.
And the last document, State's Exhibit 7F, a business record certification from USAA Federal Savings Bank for an account statement of Cody Amato dated the transactions for the 24th to the 30th of January 2019.
Any objection?
No objection, Judge.
All right, what's been pre-marked for ID as State's Exhibit 7F will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 351 in evidence.
I just have 1 moment to...
You may. All right, members of the jury, we're going to take just a short 5-minute recess. I have some things to go over with the attorneys outside your presence. If you could please just have a short break in the jury room. You may be seated. All right, at this point, first of all, to ask the state, are there any motions?
Yes, Your Honor, at this point, defense moves for judgment of acquittal. May I approach, Your
You
Honor?
may.
Your Honor, even when viewing the evidence in light of most favorable to the non-moving party, which in this case, the state of Florida has failed to put forth sufficient evidence so that any reasonable juror could find for them in this matter. Specifically, what we've seen from the state of Florida's case is their case is totally predicated upon circumstantial evidence. I want to draw the court's attention to 3 cases, but mainly to the first case I have in front of Your Honor, which is Smoker v. State. It's a Fifth Circuit case, 662 Southern 2nd, 1255. In that case, Your Honor, Tom Smoker was convicted of killing his wife, but the case was reversed and remanded because the circumstantial evidence did not allow for a conviction in that case. And there's a lot of similarities between the Smoker case, Your Honor, and the case in front of this court. In that case, Your Honor, there was no physical evidence linking Thomas Smoker to the death of his wife. However, there was circumstantial evidence. There was evidence showing that Smoker had guilty knowledge. There was also financial motive, as well as an opportunity in that case, Your Honor. And even though the state created a strong suspicion, which we'd agree they've shown in this particular case, but in Smoker, even when the state showed a strong suspicion of guilt, The court reversed in that case where there was no physical evidence, and that has strong similarities to this case. In the second case, Your Honor, which is Lindsay versus State, Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court found where conviction is based wholly upon circumstantial evidence. A special standard of review applies. The special standard requires that the circumstances lead to a reasonable and moral certainty that the accused and no one else committed the offense charged. Again, we haven't seen any DNA evidence linking Grand Amato to this crime. We have seen no footprint evidence linking Grand Amato to this crime. We've seen no blood evidence found in any of the clothes of Grand Amato linking him to this crime. While the circumstantial evidence is great and the suspicion is great in this particular case, the standard of review is higher, Your Honor. In the last case we provided to the court is State versus Law, which is the Supreme Court of Florida case 559, Southern 2nd, 187. Again, first, head note, conviction cannot be sustained only when proof of guilt is circumstantial, no matter how strongly evidence may suggest guilt, unless evidence is inconsistent with any reasonable hypothesis of innocence. Question of whether evidence fails to include all reasonable hypotheses of innocence is for a jury to determine. Again, Your Honor, there is no physical evidence linking Grand Amato to this crime. Because of that, the standard of review is higher, Your Honor, and there must be shown no reasonable hypothesis of innocence, which we simply do not have. For those reasons, Your Honor, we ask the court to grant the motion.
Argument. State.
Well, Your Honor, first, I would initially dispute the argument that this is a circumstantial evidence case. I'll talk about that in a second, but I dispute that argument because if there is a confession is direct evidence. And in this case, there's at least evidence of that. And what I'm referring to is when Grand Amato was specifically confronted by his brother during that sheriff's office conversation, at one point indirectly, but at another point directly. Jason Amato essentially accused him of committing the murders when he said that you already made that decision for Mom, Dad, and Cody. And there was no response, no denial. That's a tacit admission. So I'd start out with that particular point, and it's for the jury to decide whether or not to accept it. But I start out with that particular point, that it's a circumstantial evidence case. But going beyond that, it's the jury's duty to determine whether or not there is a reasonable hypothesis of innocence. It's the state's responsibility to pass the threshold to get the case to the jury to make that determination simply by showing evidence that's inconsistent with the defendant's theory of events. There is no theory of events right now. We haven't heard anything put forward by the defense regarding what their theory of the case is. So there is no theory upon which the state can present evidence that's inconsistent with that. But in any event, I would dispute the argument that there's no physical evidence in this case. In this case, we have a gunshot residue that's found on a pair of gloves that's in the defendant's possession within a day and a half after the murders were committed. We know that he wore those gloves because we have his DNA inside those gloves with the 1 in 700 billion statistics. We have other evidence, the testimony from Jericho Fine, that places those gloves on him. So we have those gloves on the defendant's hands with gunshot residue within a day and a half after the murders were committed. We also have the defendant's admissions in his statement where he admitted that he was present, he was home. He lied at first about Cody, but he admitted that he was present when each victim, with regard to Margaret, he admitted that he was home all day with her. With regard to Chad, in his interview, he admitted that his father, Chad, he was home when Chad came home. He also admitted that he was home when Cody came home. We can place him in that house until at least 12:27 a.m. Probably longer than that, because if you recall the testimony from the FBI agent on the cell phone, tower testimony. We have him within that wedge, which included in that wedge is the 2112 Sultan Circle. We have Cody's phone within that wedge at 2:05 a.m. We also have those transactions that were committed on Chad's phone, where he adds onto Chad's USA application an account that is specifically his account, the PNC account. So we have him in that house with those 3 dead bodies at least until 12:27. And the reason why I'd say those bodies were dead, because if you look at those photographs, you'll see that it's a reasonable inference to draw that Cody was shot the second he walked through that door. And the evidence is that he walked through that door somewhere around 10 o'clock. The evidence is also, you can infer from the evidence, a reasonable inference that Margaret was shot first because the last computer activity on her computer was 4:44 p.m. You can then infer from a reasonable inference from the evidence that Chad was shot somewhere around 5:30 because we have him coming home from work. We have him dead near the kitchen island. We have his lunchbox on the floor. So that's a reasonable inference from the evidence. And then once again, you can draw a reasonable inference from the evidence that Cody was shot the second that he walked through that door, which was, as I said, somewhere around 10 o'clock. That combined with the defendant admitting that he was in the house. And actually, not only does that unplugged flash drive put him there till 12:27, by his own admission, he admits leaving the house somewhere around midnight. So all of those circumstances put together with no version of events offered by the defense yet makes it at least a question for the jury.
Briefly, Your Honor, the state mentioned reasonable inferences that can be made based on where bodies were located. Again, this all goes to circumstantial evidence, Your Honor. And because it's all based on circumstantial evidence, we've heard there was a tacit admission. At no point did Grant Amato ever tell investigators, "I killed my family." He never admitted to the crime. We have no witness testimony that says that Grant Amato pulled the weapon, killing his family. What we have is all circumstantial evidence, Your Honor. And even though the suspicion may be great, even though those bank records say what they say, nothing, no video, no testimony says Grant Amato pulled the trigger. And because of the higher standard of review, and because the state has only put forth circumstantial evidence, we'd ask this court to grant the motion.
Based upon the circumstances, I know you rely heavily on Smoker versus State. The one thing the court notes in Smoker versus State is there was specifically no gunshot residue found in the briefcase on the person or anything in regards to the case. And the victim was found somewhere else 2.9 miles or 3 miles from a hotel rather than in their location of their home. But based upon the circumstances, the evidence that's indicated here, at this point at least, the court is indicating that there is, the judgment of acquittal would be denied.
Yes, sir.
All right, now who's the defense's first witness?
Judge, right before that, I took a prior break to prep a witness. I tried calling over the weekend a bunch of times. Can we take a quick bathroom break really quick? I would really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
you can.
I
We'll
really
do,
tried to get in touch with her over the weekend.
that's fine. We'll do a 5-minute recess. Do you have other witnesses otherwise here? And if that witness is not, that we could call in.
I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or I should have all 8 witnesses out there, Judge.
Okay.
I mean, at least my secretary
And
reached out.
because everything that I have, we've got, everybody would be pretty short, so.
Judge, the people,
You've got Rubart, Funk, Johansson, Young, Coors.
I
Are you
was just
still
going to give
calling?
the state the courtesy to let them know when I'm calling who. I don't have a problem with that. Sloan Young, Nicholas Stewart, Geraldine Bly, Rubart, Rodney Funk, Erica Johansson, Sam Coors, and then Jason Amato for one question. That's my
Okay.
8 that I have.
All right, okay. And we'll take just a short bathroom break for you guys, and then we'll get the jury back in here.